My friend and I went hiking, and I'm starting to think she never left those woods. Written by JamFranz. My friend Samantha and I were so excited to take a road trip together to go hiking somewhere further from home. We had been talking about it since we graduated college a few years back, and finally we found the time. Well, she always made the time. It was mainly me that had trouble balancing work with anything else. Looking back now, I wish I had spent more of this trip focused on Sam, the scenery, and being present in the moment. I wish I had been a better friend. Sam was the most excited for our trip. The week before we left, she was texting me about restaurants in the area, stuff to do. She made a Spotify playlist with both of our favorites so that we could listen to 7 hours worth of an eclectic mix of classic rock, pop, and black metal. And she was marking trailheads that we might enjoy on her Google Maps app. I felt bad for putting off the trip for so long. We got to catch up, explore, try cool food. We had a great trip until our final hike. We're both in decent shape, and since we had the supplies and plenty of daylight, we decided that we were going to try a longer, unpaved trail that went around this beautiful lake. It was the last hike of our trip, and we decided to take a more difficult and less crowded trail. Initially, it was a wonderful hike. The water had such a surreal shade of blue, and the pine trees and rolling hills were breathtaking. The air was thinner than we were used to, but it was so refreshing. As we hiked around one bend, I almost ran right into Sam's back. I had been falling behind, focusing on placing my feet in exactly the right locations in the soft dirt so that I didn't go sliding down 20 feet to the shore. Sam stood frozen, a deer in front of her blocking the trail. I approached with my backpack jingling and breathing heavily. The deer stood for a moment more, tilting its head sideways at me before darting back into the pines. She looked back at me, her face tight. "Did you see that?" "The deer? Yeah, it was pretty magical," I said. She gave a little laugh as she started up again so that we could both move on the section of the trail that had sturdier footing. "No, I mean, something was wrong with that deer. It was way too comfortable around me, and I don't know if you could see it or hear it, but it was drooling and making these weird sounds." We continued on in silence after that as we focused on our footing and the scenery, stopping every so often to take pictures. One time, when we were stopped, we heard rustling to our right, higher up on the hill. I got the bear spray out and I held on to it. Whatever it was seemed to be walking parallel to us, roughly matching our pace. It sounded big too. Eventually, the hiking trail rose to meet the higher part of the hill, and I couldn't help but sigh in relief. I had been so worried that I'd roll my ankle and tumble down the mountain. So it was good to have more room so I wasn't walking right on the edge. Back in college, I had sprained my ankle badly and I couldn't afford to see a doctor. It healed a bit oddly, and since then my left ankle has been iffy. After a while, I needed to sit down for a moment. Walking uphill for an hour in addition to the 6,500-foot elevation, well, I was struggling. Maybe I'm also a bit more out of shape than I had been willing to admit to. Sam sat with me for a moment, but then saw some wildflowers about 10 feet away into the woods and left to go take a quick picture. With her gone, I felt a sudden chill. Something was watching me. "Sam!" I called out nervously as the rustling grew louder and I gripped my container of bear spray tightly. It stepped out of the woods and it was just a deer. Or more specifically, it was the deer. The same one that Sam and I had encountered earlier. Now that Sam had pointed it out, I could see what she was saying. The deer had no issues approaching me. It was scrawny, walked slowly, but like it had had a bit too much to drink, and it was definitely drooling. I jumped up and waved my arms at it. "Go away!" I yelled. I knew it was sick and the poor thing was confused and probably suffering, but it creeped me out. It cocked its head and seemed to be studying me, looking me up and down. It approached me and made some sort of gasping sound. It was opening and closing its mouth in a way which deeply unsettled me for some reason. "Sam!" I called. She came running towards me from the woods, and when I turned back, it had gone. "Are you okay? What happened?" she asked. The creepy deer was back. I know it sounds silly, but I think it's been following us. I told her how it had been behaving. "Do you think that it's rabid?" I asked. "Poor baby," she said sympathetically. "Possibly, or I wonder if it has CWD. Either way, we should probably let the park rangers know just in case." We had decided that we would stick together, but after a few miles, she ended up ahead of me again. She tends to inch forward to get pictures, whereas I tend to walk past sites, then have regrets and double back to take pictures. I had walked back a bit and was sitting down angling my phone weirdly to try and fit the scene in front of me in the frame when I heard Sam's voice. But I couldn't make out what she was saying. "Hey, I'll be right there," I said, my voice raised slightly, assuming that she was calling to me. Then she screamed. "Sam!" I stood up and I tried to walk as quickly and carefully as possible. Her screaming changed from fear to agony, and it sounded like she was sobbing. I wasn't sure what had happened, but I could tell that she was scared and likely hurt. I suddenly realized that I was still holding our only canister of bear spray. Against my better judgment, I started running as fast as I could, and for a while I was making good time. But then, my left foot landed in a patch of soft dirt at the edge of the trail and my ankle rolled, and I was falling. I don't remember hitting the ground, but I remember opening my eyes flat on my back, about 15 feet below where I had been standing. It was also dark outside. We had started hiking at least 6 to 7 hours before sunset. I tried to stand, but it was a struggle. I was confused, disorientated. Trying to get up was taking all of my energy and focus. I had a deep feeling of dread that I couldn't explain. As I slowly started moving upwards on my hands and knees, I tried to recall what had happened leading to my fall. Sam sounded hurt. She was screaming. I had run after her and then I fell. "Shit, Sam." I called her name. My voice was hoarse, but there was no response. My phone was surprisingly only minorly damaged, but I had no reception. Luckily, since it had been buckled to me, I still had my backpack. I dug through it. We had first aid kits, but I figured I could patch myself up later. I didn't want to stay down here any longer than I had to. I found my knife and my headlamp. After about 20 minutes, I had slowly and painfully ascended back towards where I had fallen from. My hands were raw, and I could feel my right knee bleeding through my pants. I was trying to go slowly since I trusted my feet even less now, and dizziness was starting to creep in. But panic and fear drove me forward. Once I made it back to the trail, I had to sit for a moment. I heard rustling behind me and I felt a sudden pang of fear. Something or someone had injured Sam, and here I was sitting alone, injured, with my back to the woods, in the dark. I tried calling her name in case it was her that I heard. There was no response. I stood up and started limping as quickly as possible towards the direction that I had last heard her scream. Luckily, the ground had evened out because I could feel myself weaving unsteadily. I knew something terrible may have happened to her, but I kept trying to keep that thought out of my mind. As my calls to her remained unanswered, it became harder and harder to imagine a scenario in which she was okay. I felt my throat tighten and tears roll down my cheeks. I kept looking for her. I knew that she wouldn't just leave me here. I think that part of me knew then that she was gone. She would have been searching for me if she was okay, and even if she left to get help, I think they would have found me by then. Somehow, eventually, I navigated my way to where I thought she had last been. I was hoping maybe if she was injured, she would be okay and just out of it and confused like I was. My foot caught in the mud and I fell. Lights flashed behind my eyelids and I felt overcome with nausea. The light from my headlamp had dimmed greatly as it was now coated in mud and grime. I heard movement behind me. As the smell hit me, I realized the mud was dirt mixed with blood. I could taste it, mixed with the gritty texture. Leaves covered what was likely blood stuck to my face, and I felt something soft and wet under my shoulder. The rustling behind me became discernible as footsteps. I felt around for my knife, my bear spray, but instead I felt something hard, sticky. I was certain I had just found out what had happened to Sam and had a good guess at what was about to happen next to me. I felt no urge to get up as the footsteps got closer. I knew I couldn't outrun it. I closed my eyes, trying to focus on something, anything else, not knowing if I wanted to see what was coming for me. The footsteps stopped, and I could hear labored breathing coming from above me. I waited, and then, as no blows came, I opened my eyes. It was Sam. She stood over me, breathing heavily from her mouth. She was covered in blood. Her shirt and pants were torn, but she was alive. I let out a relieved sob and then could no longer hold back the tears. "Oh my God," I whispered as I slowly moved to a sitting and then standing position. "I thought that I had lost you," I said. I pulled her close to me into a hug. She stood motionless, her arms at her side. She stuck to me where her shirt was still a bit wet. Dried blood covered the neck of her shirt and her midsection. Her hands and, unsettlingly, her mouth were also smeared with blood. I could still hear her breathing heavily close to my ear. "What happened?" I asked as I released her. She stared at me but didn't respond. I figured that she was a bit traumatized. Frankly, I wasn't sure how she was up and standing after whatever had happened. She was a bit wobbly, but otherwise seemed to be able to walk. As we walked towards the car, she fell behind me, which made me nervous as I didn't want to let her out of my sight. She kept stopping and staring over her shoulder while I tried to coax her forward. Eventually, after what felt like forever, we made it back. My ankle was killing me, but I had tried to move as fast as possible. The woods were eerily silent. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. When we got to her car, I was debating whether we should drive ourselves to the hospital or call 911. I had this feeling of terror that I just couldn't shake. I pictured us making it all the way here to the car and then something breaking the windows and attacking us. I decided that we needed to leave now. "Do you have your keys? Do you think that you can drive?" I asked. Sam had an old Jeep pickup and was very sensitive about letting other people drive her baby. Plus, I wasn't sure that I could drive with my ankle as it was. She said nothing, just cocked her head and stared at me. "I know, we look like we've been mauled by a bear." I caught myself and winced, feeling suddenly insensitive. She clearly had been attacked by something or someone. When she said nothing, displayed no emotion or reaction, I cautiously continued. "But I have a bad feeling. I think that we need to leave right now. I would rather call for help when we're back on the main road or just drive straight to the hospital." She remained motionless, staring back into the woods, and I wondered if she had lost her keys in whatever struggle she had. Luckily, I had her spare with me. I unlocked the doors and she continued to stand outside. I realized I would need to punish my ankle a bit more because she was far too out of it to drive. I slid into the car, but she remained motionless. "Sam, get in, please. Something is out here still. Please." She was licking her lips, staring back at me again. In the darkness, her blue eyes almost looked black. I limped back out of the seat and I opened her door for her, and I then had to guide her in. I buckled her in after she made no move to do so herself. As we drove and the headlights of passing cars illuminated the interior, I kept checking on her out of the corner of my eye. She was breathing in and out of her mouth and staring at me. I noticed now in the better light that she was drooling. "Hey, how are you doing?" I asked. No response. But she began opening and closing her mouth and making a wet, gasping sound as she breathed in and out. Her breath reeked and her teeth were tinged pink. I don't have much medical knowledge, but I was worried that she had a punctured lung due to the strange sounds that she was making. "Hold on tight, we're about 20 minutes from the hospital," I said. Despite my ankle, I drove as fast as I could. We made it in 10. As I pulled up, I helped guide her out of the car and walked behind her, steadying her. I noticed something. Her shirt was on, inside out. It hadn't been this morning. Likely because of how we looked, they found room for us immediately in the ER. I had a bad sprain and a concussion, and I would need a few stitches. But it felt so good to just be out of those woods. I asked the nurse that came back in to check on me about how Sam was doing. I mentioned to him that I'm not sure if she was attacked by an animal or by a person. I mentioned what I had noticed about her shirt and that we may have encountered a sick animal, in case any of that helped. When he returned, he was clearly distressed. Sam was gone. She hadn't appeared to be outwardly injured, strangely, but they had wanted to assess for internal trauma. However, the first moment that they had left her alone, she had just walked out, judging by the bloody footprints. It's been weeks, and I haven't seen Sam since. Her mom hasn't either. She's been working with the police out here. They think that Sam has a head wound and is just confused and will turn up in town eventually. But a few days ago, I heard on the news that a partial skeleton was found on the trail that we were on. Likely the victim of an animal attack, they said. And due to the condition of the body, they were asking for leads so that they could use dental records to help identify the victim. This might sound crazy, but I think it's her they found. I don't know how to explain it, but I don't think that Sam ever left those woods that night. It's my fault. And I don't know what that thing was that I drove into town. So, if you live in southern Colorado, please be safe. I'm sorry.